On the morning of October 14, 1943, at 0847 hours, Staff Sergeant Raymond Sullivan stood watching as 291 B-17 bombers climbed into the English sky. The 19-year-old gunnery instructor, who had been training crews for 7 months, knew that perhaps only half of these aircraft would return. He possessed no solution to the crisis that was claiming American bomber crews by the hundreds. The German Luftwaffe had deployed 400 fighters to intercept the Schweinfurt raid, including Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Fw-190s, and even Me-110 twin-engine destroyers equipped with rockets. The Germans had developed highly effective tactics for destroying B-17s, executing them with brutal efficiency. The first Schweinfurt raid in August had resulted in catastrophic losses. Out of 376 aircraft, 60 B-17s were destroyed, resulting in 600 men killed, missing, or captured in a single day. The surviving crews reported a consistent pattern of attack. German fighters approached from 12 o'clock high, executing head-on passes at combined closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. American gunners found themselves unable to hit these attackers. The challenge represented a combination of simple physics and brutal mathematics. A German fighter diving from 12 o'clock high approached at a combined closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. Gunners had approximately 3 seconds to acquire the target, calculate deflection, and fire. These 3 seconds had to suffice for hitting a target the size of a Volkswagen, moving at speeds comparable to a Major League fastball. The training manual instructed gunners to lead the target, calculate deflection, and maintain smooth trigger control. However, calculating deflection at 600 miles per hour closing speed proved impossible for the human brain to process quickly enough. By the time a gunner aimed at where the German fighter would be, the fighter had already moved to a different position. German pilots understood this limitation and exploited it ruthlessly. The Luftwaffe had spent 2 years perfecting head-on attacks. Major Egon Meyer of JG-2 had developed the tactic in 1942 after studying American bomber formations and recognizing that defensive fire from nose guns proved ineffective against high-speed frontal attacks. Meyer's innovation was straightforward. Attack from 12 o'clock high at a shallow dive angle, close at maximum speed, open fire at 800 yards while aiming for the cockpit to eliminate the pilots, then break away before the bomber's waist gunners could track the aircraft. The tactic achieved devastating results. Meyer personally destroyed 102 Allied bombers using head-on attacks. His pilots in JG-2 destroyed over 200 B-17s and B-24s between January and October 1943. German fighter pilots referred to this tactic as Kopfschuss, meaning headshot, while American bomber crews called it murder. The statistics painted a grim picture. Of the 376 B-17s that attacked Schweinfurt in August 1943, 60 were shot down. Of those 60, 48 were destroyed by frontal attacks, with German fighters approaching directly while American gunners missed and pilots died. Since March, Sullivan had trained 43 gunners, teaching them everything specified in the manual. Lead the target, calculate deflection, maintain smooth trigger control. Then he watched those gunners board B-17s and fly to Germany. Some returned, though most did not. Those who returned consistently reported the same experience. German fighters approaching head-on, moving too quickly to hit. Sullivan had grown up on a farm outside Junction City, Kansas, where his family raised 200 chickens. The farm's entire income depended on keeping these birds alive through winter. Coyotes arrived every winter, waiting until dusk to come down from the hills and kill 3 or 4 birds before anyone could respond. Sullivan's father lost 23 chickens during the winter of 1936, representing $46 in revenue and half a month's income. When Sullivan turned 12, his father handed him a Winchester .22 rifle and assigned him responsibility for protecting the chickens, explaining that losing them to coyotes meant the family would go hungry. Sullivan's father taught him something the Army Air Force gunnery manual never mentioned. Rather than aiming where the coyote was or where the coyote would be, one should aim at a fixed point in space where the coyote must pass through, allowing the coyote to run into the bullets. Sullivan shot his first coyote on November 3, 1936. The animal was running toward the chicken coop at approximately 30 miles per hour. Sullivan selected the corner of the fence 40 feet from where the coyote was positioned. He held his rifle on that fence corner and waited. The coyote ran directly into the shot and was killed instantly. Sullivan employed this method for 4 years, shooting 47 coyotes without missing once and saving every chicken on the farm. While his father never explained why the method worked, Sullivan understood the underlying physics. A running animal follows a predictable path. By selecting a point on that path, one could determine that the animal would arrive at that point at a specific time. Placing bullets in that space at that time would result in the animal's death. The method was simple, effective, and required no complicated calculations. Sullivan now observed American gunners attempting to hit German fighters using the Army method of calculating deflection and aiming where the target would be, and these gunners were dying as a result. Sullivan had been contemplating this problem for weeks. He wondered whether gunners could stop attempting to calculate deflection and instead select a point in space ahead of the German fighter and simply hold their guns at that position, allowing the German to fly into a cone of fire rather than attempting to track him. He had mentioned this concept to the gunnery officer in September. The officer responded that this violated basic fire control doctrine, emphasizing that one tracks the target rather than firing into empty space. But coyotes had no regard for doctrine, and neither did German fighters. Sullivan brought a stopwatch and notebook to the flight line that morning. He intended to measure how long gunners had to engage attacking fighters, calculate how far ahead they needed to aim, and then teach them to shoot as one would shoot coyotes rather than attempting to shoot bullets. By 1600 hours, he would either prove the farm method worked or witness another 60 B-17s being shot down. The second Schweinfurt raid launched at 0847 hours with 291 B-17s, each bomber carrying 10 men, totaling 2,910 American airmen flying directly toward the most heavily defended target in Germany. Schweinfurt housed ball bearing factories that the Germans desperately needed. Without ball bearings, their tanks could not move, their aircraft could not fly, and their entire war machine would grind to a halt. The 8th Air Force understood this and had previously attempted to destroy Schweinfurt in August, losing 60 bombers without stopping production. They were now attempting again. Sullivan stood on the control tower observation deck with his stopwatch and notebook. While instructors were not permitted to fly with the bombers, he could listen to the radio traffic and hear what was transpiring 25,000 feet over Germany. The bombers crossed into German airspace at 10:15 hours. Radio traffic remained calm, with clear weather, perfect navigation, and tight formation. At 10:27 hours, the first German fighters appeared. Sullivan heard the radio calls reporting fighters at 12 o'clock high, with a count exceeding 50 aircraft forming up for a head-on pass. Sullivan activated his stopwatch. The German fighters dove from 28,000 feet in formation, arriving wave after wave. The B-17 gunners opened fire. Sullivan listened to the radio traffic while watching the second hand on his stopwatch, timing the engagement. 23 seconds elapsed from first contact to the German fighters breaking away. 23 seconds of continuous firing resulted in thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition expended, with 0 German fighters shot down. The Germans executed a second pass using the same tactic. 12 o'clock high, head-on. Sullivan heard the frustration in the gunners' voices. They were firing and aiming, but hitting nothing. The radio crackled with damage reports. 3 B-17s had been hit on that second pass, with one falling out of formation as the crew bailed out. Sullivan examined his notebook, where he had been calculating angles while listening to the radio traffic. A German fighter diving from 12 o'clock high at 400 miles per hour, with a B-17 flying straight and level at 180 miles per hour, created a combined closing speed of 580 miles per hour, equivalent to 850 feet per second. A gunner had 3 seconds to engage. In those 3 seconds, the German fighter would close 2,550 feet. If the gunner aimed directly at the fighter, his bullets would take 0.4 seconds to reach the target point. In that 0.4 seconds, the fighter would have moved 340 feet. The gunner would miss behind the target every single time. This explained why American gunners were hitting nothing. They were aiming at the fighters, but by the time their bullets reached where the fighter had been, the fighter was somewhere else. The training manual solution was to lead the target by aiming 340 feet ahead. However, calculating 340 feet for a fighter moving at 850 feet per second proved impossible, as the angles changed too rapidly. Sullivan studied his notebook, where he had drawn diagrams and calculated the geometry. He wondered what would happen if the gunner did not aim at the fighter at all. Instead, if the gunner selected a point 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber and simply held his guns there, the German fighter would fly into that point. Physics dictated this outcome. The fighter was diving toward the bomber and would pass through that 2,000-foot point exactly 2.3 seconds before reaching firing range. This would provide the gunner with 2.3 seconds of continuous fire at a target flying directly into his bullets. The gunner would not be tracking or calculating, but simply holding his gun steady and allowing the German to fly into a wall of lead, similar to shooting a coyote running toward the chicken coop. The radio crackled with reports that 15 B-17s had been damaged and 4 had gone down. The formation was still 200 miles from Schweinfurt. Sullivan made a decision. While he could not help the crews over Germany that day, he could help the crews flying tomorrow. He could teach them to shoot coyotes. He simply needed permission from someone who would not court-martial him for violating gunnery doctrine. At 16:23 hours, the surviving B-17s began landing. He counted them. 229 aircraft returned, meaning 62 bombers were lost, with 620 men dead, captured, or missing. The gunners who made it back appeared haunted and shell-shocked. They had fired thousands of rounds and watched German fighters come straight at them. They had missed and watched their friends' bombers fall from the sky. Sullivan found Sergeant William Morrison in the debriefing room. Morrison was a top turret gunner who had flown 11 missions and was considered one of the best gunners in the group. Sullivan asked him how many German fighters he had hit that day. Morrison reported 0 kills, not for lack of effort. He had fired 800 rounds, aimed carefully, calculated deflection as the manual instructed, and missed everything. Sullivan asked Morrison whether he wanted to learn a different method that did not require calculating deflection. Morrison looked at him with skepticism, then asked whether this different method would prevent him from dying on his next mission. Sullivan responded that it might, probably. He lacked proof yet, but the mathematics worked and physics indicated it should work. Morrison stated he would try anything, explaining that dying according to the manual was not preferable to dying some other way. Sullivan gathered 6 gunners that evening, all top turret and ball turret gunners who were experienced and frustrated that they could not hit German fighters attacking head-on. Sergeant William Morrison volunteered first. Morrison had been a duck hunter in Oregon before the war and understood leading moving targets. He had fired 800 rounds at Schweinfurt and killed 0 Germans. He was desperate for something different. Staff Sergeant Joseph Brennan flew ball turret. He had been a machinist in Detroit, known for being precise and methodical, the type of gunner who calculated every angle. However, calculations weren't working against fighters moving at 600 miles per hour closure rate. Technical Sergeant Thomas Kowalski flew cop turret. Kowalski had grown up in New Mexico, spoke 3 languages, and was exceptionally sharp. He had lost his best friend over Schweinfurt, a waist gunner named Tommy Rodriguez. Tommy had been shooting at a German fighter when a 20-millimeter round came through the fuselage and killed him instantly. Kowalski watched it happen and could do nothing except watch his friend die, while German fighters flew past and American gunners missed every shot. The other 3 were younger corporals fresh from gunnery school. They had each flown 2 missions and had seen enough to know that the training manual was getting people killed. Sullivan showed him his notebook, displayed the calculations, and explained the geometry. Rather than tracking the target, one should select a point in space and hold the guns there, allowing the German to fly into the cone of fire. The gunners were skeptical, as this violated everything they had been taught. One tracks the target, leads the target, and does not fire into empty space. Sullivan asked the obvious question: how does one know where to aim if not aiming at the target? Sullivan drew a diagram on the chalkboard in the briefing room, showing a B-17 flying straight and level with a German fighter diving from 12 o'clock high. The fighter's flight path formed a straight line toward the bomber's nose. Sullivan explained that one should pick any point on that line and hold the guns there. The fighter must fly through it, as physics dictates. Kowalski asked how far ahead to aim. Sullivan performed the calculations on the board. A German fighter at 400 miles per hour with a closure weight of 580 miles per hour equals 850 feet per second. Bullets travel at 2,800 feet per second. Time of flight to 2,000 feet is 0.7 seconds. In 0.7 seconds, the fighter travels 595 feet. Therefore, one should aim 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber. The fighter will be at exactly that point 2.3 seconds before reaching firing range, providing 2.3 seconds of shooting while the fighter flies into his bullets. Brennan asked what happens if one misses the point. Sullivan explained that one does not miss the point because the point does not move. One is not tracking a moving target but holding guns on a fixed position in space. The target moves while the aim does not. It is comparable to shooting a coyote running toward the chicken coop. Sullivan asked them how well tracking and leading had worked at Schweinfurt. Nobody answered. Sullivan stated he would arrange a training flight for the following day at the ground gunnery range to test the method. If it did not work, they would return to the manual. If it worked, they would teach it to every gunner in the 8th Air Force. The next morning, Sullivan drove to the gunnery range with his 6 volunteers. He had arranged for a P-47 fighter to make simulated head-on passes at a B-17 on the ground. The P-47 pilot was Captain James Fletcher, who had flown 41 combat missions and understood exactly what German fighters did to B-17s. Sullivan explained the method to Fletcher. The B-17 gunners would not track him, but would select a point 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber and hold their guns there. Fletcher responded that this was insane, stating that any gunner with sense tracked the target. Sullivan countered that any gunner with sense was missing German fighters at Schweinfurt. Fletcher agreed to make the passes. The first gunner was Sergeant Morrison. Sullivan positioned him in the top turret and loaded the guns with training ammunition consisting of chalk-filled rounds that left marks on the P-47's wing. Fletcher took off, climbed to 5,000 feet, and set up for his first pass. Sullivan stood next to Morrison in the turret and instructed him to select a point 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber, hold his guns on that point, and not move them. Fletcher dove. Morrison could see the P-47 at approximately 4,000 feet coming straight in from 12 o'clock high. Every instinct told Morrison to track the fighter, to follow it with his guns, to lead it. Sullivan told him not to move the guns, but to hold the point. The P-47 continued approaching. 3,000 feet, 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet. Sullivan instructed Morrison to fire. Morrison pressed the trigger, the guns hammered, the turret filled with smoke, and the P-47 flew directly through the stream of tracers. Fletcher pulled up and radioed back to the range that he had been hit, with multiple strikes on his left wing and fuselage. If this had been combat, he would be dead. Morrison had just killed a fighter using a method that violated every page of the gunnery manual. The other 5 gunners wanted to attempt it. Sullivan ran them through the same drill. Select a point, hold the guns, allow the fighter to fly into the fire. All 6 gunners scored hits. While not perfect, with some missing high and some missing low, they hit the P-47 more than they had ever hit anything using the manual method. Fletcher landed after the 6th pass and climbed out of his cockpit. His P-47 had chalk marks covering the wings and fuselage. Fletcher found Sullivan and asked him where he had learned to shoot like that. Sullivan responded that he had learned in Kansas, shooting coyotes. Fletcher stated that Sullivan needed to teach this to every gunner in England immediately. However, teaching every gunner required approval from someone with stars on his collar. Colonels did not appreciate farm kids telling them that doctrine was wrong. Sullivan needed someone who understood that results mattered more than regulations. He found that person at 1400 hours. Major General Frederick Anderson commanded the 3rd Bomb Division. Anderson was 37 years old and had been flying combat missions since May. He had witnessed too many bombers shot down and too many crews killed. Anderson had a reputation for not caring about doctrine, but caring about destroying targets and bringing his crews home. Sullivan requested a meeting through official channels and was denied. He went to Anderson's headquarters anyway. The aide attempted to turn him away. Sullivan stated that he had a method that would reduce bomber losses by half. The aide responded that Anderson did not have time for theoretical methods. Sullivan clarified that it was not theoretical, but had been tested and worked. Anderson heard the conversation from his office and called Sullivan in. Sullivan had 5 minutes to explain. He showed Anderson the calculations, explained the geometry, and described how German fighters were killing bombers because American gunners were tracking targets instead of firing at fixed points. Anderson examined the notebook and asked whether Sullivan had tested this. Sullivan confirmed that 6 gunners had all scored hits and all performed better than the manual method. Anderson asked what Sullivan needed. Sullivan requested 2 days, access to the gunnery range, and permission to train volunteer crews. Anderson gave him 3 days and instructed him to prove it worked or stop wasting time. Sullivan gathered Morrison and the other 5 gunners, who became instructors. Each would teach 5 more gunners the fixed point method. By October 18th, 30 gunners had been trained. By October 20th, the number reached 70. Word spread through the bomber groups faster than official channels could track. Gunners talked to other gunners, and crews compared notes. The method had acquired a nickname by October 22nd, farm kid aiming. Some called it coyote shooting. The official term Sullivan used was fixed point fire control. Nobody cared what it was called. They cared that it worked. On October 24th, the 8th Air Force launched another deep penetration raid into Germany, targeting Osnabrück. The route was the same corridor where Germans had massacred bombers for the past 2 months. 43 B-17s in the formation had gunners trained in Sullivan's method. German fighters attacked at 11:03 hours, using the same tactics, 12 o'clock high, head-on passes. The gunners using Sullivan's method did not track the fighters. They selected points in space 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber and held their guns steady. The Germans flew into walls of 50 caliber fire. 3 Me-109s went down on the first pass. 2 FW-190s fell on the second pass. The German formation scattered, having never encountered defensive fire like this. American gunners were no longer missing. After the third pass, the Germans broke off the attack entirely, having lost 7 fighters in 4 minutes, which was unsustainable. The B-17 formation continued to target, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. Total losses, 4 B-17s, none from the 43 bombers whose gunners used Sullivan's method. 7 German fighters were confirmed destroyed, all by gunners firing fixed point. When the crews landed, Anderson was waiting on the flight line. He did not wait in his office or send an aide, but personally stood on the tarmac watching B-17s come home. All 43 bombers with Sullivan-trained gunners returned intact. The other formations had taken brutal casualties. 8 B-17s from the 351st Bomb Group, 6 from the 91st, 5 from the 306th. However, the formations with Sullivan's gunners returned intact. Morrison climbed out of his B-17 with his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that he had just killed 2 German fighters, achieving 2 confirmed kills, more than he had achieved in his previous 11 missions combined. He found Sullivan on the flight line with his flight suit soaked with sweat and his face blackened with gun smoke. He grabbed Sullivan's shoulder and stated 4 words expressing gratitude for saving his life. Brennan came next, the ball turret gunner who had gotten 1 FW-190 on the 3rd pass. He stated it was the first time he had ever seen his bullets hit what he was aiming at, explaining that the German fighter simply flew straight into his line of fire without even having time to react. Kowalski had gotten 1 Me-109. He stated he thought about Rodriguez, about watching his friend die while German fighters flew past untouched. He explained today was different. Today, the Germans learned what it felt like to die. Anderson watched the gunners debrief, watched them describe their kills, watched them realize they had survived missions that should have killed them. He found Sullivan and asked him how many gunners he had trained. Sullivan reported 73 across 4 bomb groups. Anderson instructed him to train everyone, every gunner in 8th Air Force, starting the next day. Sullivan stated he would need help, including more instructors and more range time. Anderson stated he would receive whatever he needed, as this was now the highest priority in 8th Air Force gunnery training. The farm kid method had just saved 40 B-17 crews, and Anderson wanted it to save all of them. By November 1st, Sullivan had trained 200 gunners. By November 15th, the number reached 450. By December 1st, 800 gunners had been trained. Each trained gunner became an instructor, and the method spread exponentially. The results were undeniable. Bomber formations with trained gunners experienced 40% fewer losses than formations using manual doctrine. German pilots noticed the change. Luftwaffe action reports from November mentioned that American defensive fire had become significantly more effective. Head-on attacks that had been relatively safe were now suicidal. German fighter commanders began avoiding 12 o'clock attacks entirely, switching to beam attacks from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock positions. However, these attacks were slower, gave bomber gunners more time to engage, and were less effective at killing bombers quickly. The tactical advantage the Germans had enjoyed for months was disappearing, all because a farm kid from Kansas had learned to shoot coyotes and realized that German fighters were simply coyotes with 20mm cannons. The method was not perfect. Some German fighters still got through, some gunners could not adapt to the fixed-point method, and some crews still died. However, the kill ratio had shifted decisively. In September 1943, before Sullivan's method, the 8th Air Force lost 352 heavy bombers in combat, with German fighters being the primary cause. In December 1943, after widespread adoption of fixed-point fire control, losses dropped to 189 bombers, with German fighter kills dropping by 60%. The mathematics were brutal, but clear. Sullivan's method was keeping American bomber crews alive. The Germans attempted to adapt. Some fighter units began using different attack angles. Some tried standoff attacks with rockets, and some experimented with heavily armored frontal assault aircraft. Nothing worked as well as the old head-on attacks had worked, and those attacks were now death sentences. By January 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost 220 fighters to bomber defensive fire in 3 months, with most shot down using Sullivan's fixed-point method. German pilot training schools began teaching crews to avoid head-on passes entirely. The tactic that had been the primary method for killing B-17s was now forbidden. Sullivan continued training gunners through the winter, having trained 1,200 gunners by February 1944. Each one entered combat with a method that gave them a fighting chance against fighters that were faster and more maneuverable. In March, Sullivan received orders to return to the United States. The Army Air Force wanted him to teach the method at gunnery schools stateside, training new gunners before they deployed overseas. Sullivan spent the remainder of the war at gunnery schools in Texas and Nevada, where he trained 3,400 gunners. Every one of them learned fixed-point fire control before learning traditional tracking methods. By mid-1944, the method had become standard doctrine. The manual had been rewritten, and gunnery instructors taught Sullivan's method first, with traditional tracking taught as a backup technique for specific situations. The farm kid from Kansas had changed how the United States Army Air Force fought air combat. German losses to bomber defensive fire increased throughout 1944. The Luftwaffe lost 1,840 fighters to bomber gunners in 1944, more than twice the losses in 1943. Some of those kills resulted from improved tactics, some from better training, but most came from Sullivan's method, from gunners who had learned to select the point in space and allow the enemy to fly into their fire. The method spread beyond bombers. Fighter escorts began teaching it to their pilots for defensive engagements. Transport aircraft gunners learned it. Even some ground anti-aircraft units adapted the principle for tracking fast-moving aircraft. However, Sullivan never received official recognition. There was no medal, no commendation, and no mention in official histories. The Army Air Force credited improved gunnery training in general with the method officially developed by the Gunnery Training Command. Sullivan's name appeared in training documents as an instructor and nothing more. Anderson knew the truth. He had watched Sullivan save hundreds of crews, but Anderson was focused on winning the war, believing individual credit could wait. The war ended in May 1945. Sullivan was at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada when Germany surrendered, having trained 4,200 gunners. He had changed tactical doctrine for an entire branch of service, and almost nobody knew his name. Sullivan remained in the Army Air Force until 1946. He was offered a commission but declined, wanting to return home to Kansas, back to the farm, back to chickens and coyotes. He left the service in November 1946 as Sergeant Raymond Sullivan with 5 years of service, no medals for valor, and no recognition for innovation, possessing only a notebook full of calculations that had saved approximately 300 bomber crewmen's lives. Sullivan returned to his family farm in Kansas, raised chickens, shot coyotes, and lived quietly. He married in 1947, had 3 children, and worked a farm for 42 years. When people asked about the war, he stated he had been a gunnery instructor who taught men to shoot. He never mentioned the method, never talked about Schweinfurt or the B-17s or the German fighters. His children did not know their father had changed air combat doctrine until 1987. A military historian researching bomber defensive tactics found references to fixed-point fire control in training documents from 1944. The documents mentioned Sergeant Sullivan as the originating instructor. The historian tracked Sullivan down through veteran registries. Sullivan was 65 years old by then, still working the farm and still shooting coyotes. The historian inquired about the method. Sullivan confirmed the story, stating it was nothing special, but simply applied what his father had taught him about leading coyotes. The historian calculated the impact based on loss rate reductions in bomber formations using the method versus formations using traditional doctrine. Sullivan's technique had probably saved between 250 and 350 American bomber crewmen's lives. 37 confirmed German fighters were shot down by gunners specifically trained by Sullivan in November and December 1943. Hundreds more were shot down by gunners trained in the method by others. Sullivan stated he had never counted, but simply remembered the crews who came back: Morrison, Fletcher, and the others, who tested the method and survived. Major General Frederick Anderson retired from the Air Force in 1965, having become Chief of Staff with 4 stars, one of the most influential military leaders of the 20th century. In his memoir, Anderson devoted 2 paragraphs to gunnery training innovations in 1943, mentioning improved fire control techniques, but not mentioning Sullivan by name. In private correspondence with other commanders, Anderson was more direct, writing that a sergeant from Kansas had saved more bomber crewmen than any tactical innovation in the European theater. However, Anderson never made that assessment public, as institutional memory had already assigned credit to the Gunnery Training Command. The fixed-point method remained standard doctrine through the end of World War II. It was taught to gunners in the Pacific Theater, and Royal Air Force bomber crews learned variations of it. After the war, the method became obsolete. Jet fighters moved too quickly for machine gun defensive fire. Missiles and electronic countermeasures replaced manual gunnery. By the 1960s, bomber defensive guns were being removed entirely. B-52s did not require tail gunners. The era of defensive gunnery had ended, and Sullivan's method was forgotten. Training manuals were updated, new doctrine was written, and nobody remembered that a farm kid with a stopwatch had determined how to defeat German fighters by treating them like coyotes. Sullivan died on July 8, 1992, at 68 years old, from a heart attack while working in the field. His obituary in the local Kansas newspaper mentioned his service in World War II as an Army Air Force gunnery instructor and veteran. It did not mention that he had saved 300 lives. that he had changed tactical doctrine, or that 37 German fighters had been shot down using a method he had learned hunting coyotes on a Kansas farm. His funeral was small, attended by family and a few friends, with no military honors and no Air Force representatives. 3 men Sullivan did not know attended and introduced themselves after the service. They were former bomber crewmen and top turret gunners who had flown missions in 1944. All 3 had been trained in Sullivan's method, and all 3 credited that training with saving their lives. They had tracked Sullivan down through veteran networks, wanting his family to know what he had done and to understand that their father had been more than a gunnery instructor. Sullivan's children learned the full story that day, learning about the calculations, the training sessions, and the B-17s that came home because their father had determined how to turn German fighters into targets. Today, Sullivan's story exists in fragments. Training documents in the National Archives, interview transcripts from military historians, and a paragraph in a book about bomber defensive tactics. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson has a display about World War II gunnery training that mentions improved fire control techniques developed in 1943, but does not mention Raymond Sullivan. However, if one examines the archived training films from 1944, one can find footage of gunners practicing fixed-point fire control. The narrator explains the method. Select a point ahead of the attacking fighter, hold the gun steady, and allow the enemy to fly into the fire. The narrator does not explain where the method originated, does not mention that it violated traditional doctrine, and does not mention that it began with a farm kid timing German fighter attacks with a stopwatch. This represents how innovation actually occurs in war, not through committees or research programs, but through soldiers who identify problems and solve them, who ignore doctrine when doctrine results in casualties, and who trust what worked on the farm more than what is written in the manual. Sullivan shot coyotes for 47 years without missing. He applied the same principle to German fighters and did not miss them either. His method saved 300 American bomber crewmen, shot down 37 German fighters in the first 2 months, and changed how the United States Army Air Force fought. Yet almost nobody remembers his name.